This is a strange memory from my younger days, and I hope you all find it intriguing. Years ago, our family had a tradition of going on weekend camping trips during the warmer months, especially in late spring and early autumn. Most of these trips were to the same general area, which I recall as follows. We'd drive about 30 miles out of town along a rural highway before turning onto a dirt road leading up into the mountains. This entire region was ideal for outdoor activities, hiking, target practice, off-roading, you name it. The dirt road climbed steadily into a thick forest, with smaller trails branching off to forgotten corners of the wilderness. Eventually, if you drove far enough, you'd reach an old, abandoned quarry. It wasn't massive, but it had a couple of deep blast holes and piles of broken granite scattered around. To my sister and me, it was a fascinating place to explore during our camping adventures. Strangely, most people seemed to stop at the quarry, either assuming it was private property or simply not realizing there was more beyond it. Past the quarry lay open camping spots, and we always snagged the flattest one, giving us the entire area to ourselves. This particular trip started like all the others: bright skies, cheerful moods, and a familiar path winding through pine and oak trees. We set up a simple camp, just a tent, a foldable table, and some chairs. The fire pit, clearly built years before, was ringed with stones, perfect for warming up coffee or hot chocolate. We had a blast, sipping soda, plinking empty cans with BB guns, and occasionally using a small .22 rifle that Dad was teaching us to handle responsibly. When we weren't practicing our aim or carving wooden trinkets, we explored the forest, gathered firewood, or simply relaxed, taking in the sounds of nature. The highlight of our trips was always a walk to the nearby lake, just beyond a bend in the road. The route split into two paths. One led to a rusty iron gate with a no-access sign, marking an old, steep trail down to the water. This path had been closed off decades earlier due to safety concerns, though it was still passable on foot. A newer trail, created in the 1950s, provided easier access to the lake and had a proper parking lot, making it the preferred option for most visitors. However, since the old trail was practically abandoned, my sister and I had the whole area to ourselves. We'd spend hours by the lake, skipping stones, fishing, or catching frogs and other critters. Early mornings were especially magical, with deer, rabbits, and sometimes even a fox or an eagle making an appearance. On this particular morning, my sister and I had planned to head to the lake right after sunrise. We grabbed our fishing gear and set off down the dusty road, chatting as we walked. About 15 minutes into our journey, something unusual caught my eye. A car parked at the iron gate. It wasn't unheard of for someone to use this old access point, but it wasn't common either. As we got closer, I noticed two people in the car, a man and a woman, engaged in quiet conversation. The car itself was unremarkable. An older model, not flashy or beat up, just plain. When we were within earshot, the man leaned out the window and called to us in a cheerful voice. "Good morning, kids," he said, his tone surprisingly warm and friendly. We greeted him back, my sister waving while I nodded, hands full with my fishing rod and tackle box. "Isn't it a bit early for you two? Where are your folks?" he asked. "They're back at camp," I replied, gesturing behind me. "They'll join us later." The woman in the passenger seat smiled. "Be careful, you two. It's a steep walk down." We thanked them and continued toward the gate. Their demeanor seemed normal at first, just a couple of strangers being polite. But as we passed, the man called out again, "Hey, kid!" I stopped and turned back. "Yeah, that's your sister, right?" he asked, his voice taking on an odd tone. Yeah, I replied cautiously. "Why?" "Just look out for each other," he said, his face splitting into a grin that was far too wide and unsettling. The woman joined in, her smile equally eerie. The friendly facade vanished, replaced by something that sent shivers down my spine. I quickly caught up with my sister, who seemed oblivious to the odd exchange. The encounter left a strange, heavy feeling in my chest, but we pressed on, eager to reach the lake. When we arrived, the water sparkled under the morning sun, and we set up our gear. Fishing started off great, with a few nibbles here and there, but as the day wore on, things started to feel off. A pair of bloody dress shoes floated by, followed by streaks of dried blood on the rocks. My sister and I exchanged nervous glances. The eeriness escalated when we noticed a tarp smeared with what looked like blood tucked into the hillside above the lake. We decided it was time to leave. As we climbed the steep trail back to the road, the sense of unease grew. When we reached the top, the car was still there, but its occupants were gone. Suddenly, we heard a sharp whistle. Turning, we saw the man standing motionless among the trees, his dress shoes now missing. The woman's voice came from somewhere nearby, her tone deceptively friendly. Panic set in, and we bolted for camp, arriving breathless and frantic. Our parents took our story seriously, though they found no sign of the couple or the blood-streaked tarp when they checked later. The strange car remained parked for the rest of our trip, but we never saw those unsettling strangers again. To this day, the memory of that encounter haunts me, a mystery I'll likely never solve. A few years back, my friend Mia and I decided to embark on an epic road trip across the United States. Our plan was to travel from Boston to San Francisco, weaving through the country for about 6 weeks. We were both in our early 20s, low on cash and eager for adventure. Since my dad had been a long-haul trucker, I suggested we save money by sleeping in the back of my hatchback. It was a snug setup. We bought some second-hand blankets and curtains from a thrift store, repurposing one for privacy. By the end of the first week, we had our routine down to 10 minutes. Luggage moved to the front, curtains hung, bedding arranged and ready for the night. We slept wherever it felt safe and semi-legal: parking lots, rest stops, free campsites. After the first night, we never felt scared until our last week in Arizona. Near Sedona, we'd grown accustomed to our flexible routine. We avoided strict schedules, driving no more than 3 or 4 hours daily, and aimed for a handful of must-see landmarks. We'd find spots through Google, tips from locals or fellow travelers. We had also gotten good at making friends, eating at diners with strangers, learning to line dance from an 80-year-old cowboy, jamming with musicians during a storm, and celebrating Independence Day with a family who treated us like their own. Every encounter was positive until that night. We located a free campsite using our GPS and headed deep into the woods. Something felt slightly off when we arrived. There was a single RV parked and 2 cars tucked further into the trees. We stopped near the RV, and a man opened the door. Mia waved hello, but he just stared blankly before shutting the door without a word. Assuming he wanted privacy, we parked further away and found a flat spot. Instead of setting up camp immediately as usual, we joked around, smoked, and took silly photos until dusk. Mia noticed a campfire deeper in the woods, so we decided to check it out, hoping to meet new people like we had all trip. At the fire, we found 2 men, one older and seemingly high, spinning in circles and talking about UFOs, and another younger man who said he was a former park ranger. The ranger was friendly and chatty, and we spent hours talking about life, travel, and his time in the wilderness. Then he mentioned spotting a bear nearby earlier that day. Mia was skeptical, so he pulled out a camera and showed us photos. The bear had been close to the campsite, which made us nervous since we often stepped out of the car at night. The ranger chuckled at our concern, but then turned serious, saying, "If you leave your car at night, it's not the bear you should worry about." We both laughed uneasily, waiting for him to admit it was a joke. He didn't. I made a light joke about horror movies, trying to shift the mood, and Mia chimed in with a comment about scary woods. But the ranger kept steering the conversation back to ominous remarks about dangers lurking in the dark. Meanwhile, the older man was too spaced out to engage. At one point, the ranger got up to grab a drink from a cooler outside the fire's glow. Suddenly, we saw a red light in the darkness, a camera. He was taking photos of us. It wasn't unusual for people to ask for pictures during our trip, but this felt different. He didn't ask or explain. He adjusted his camera settings and snapped another photo with the flash, again without a word. Mia and I were frozen, staring at him. He returned to the fire without mentioning the photos, and the conversation continued awkwardly. Uneasy, we made an excuse about needing to set up our campsite and left. The older man cheerfully bid us good night, but the ranger stared with an unsettling smile and said, "Be careful out there. There's more than bears in the woods." Every hair on my body stood on end. Mia laughed nervously, grabbed my arm, and led us quickly back to the car. We didn't waste a second, jumping into the front seats and locking the doors. As we sat there, hearts pounding, Mia whispered, "Why did he take those pictures?" Shaking, I replied, "I read somewhere that some killers warn their victims." Her face paled, and she locked the doors again. "Do you think he just took victim photos of us?" We were terrified. She turned on the headlights to see better, but I panicked and told her to shut them off. He'd know exactly where we were. For some reason, it was the only night we hadn't set up camp yet, so we didn't need to pack anything. We started the car and sped down the dirt road. As we neared the exit, we saw the ranger walking toward our vehicle. His cold expression illuminated briefly in our headlights. We didn't stop to find out what he wanted. At the base of the Jura Hills, the name Jules originates from an ancient word for woods, which feels fitting given that most of the range is blanketed by forests and meadows, unlike the towering Alps nearby, which are shaped by their high altitude. The Jura holds a deep history of myths and spiritual significance, likely tied to the various cultures, Celts, Romans, and others, that have lived there over time. However, this story leans more toward being an intriguing and eerie encounter than anything truly frightening or threatening, at least from my perspective. Growing up, I saw the Jura as a fantastic place to explore, go camping, and hike. As I matured, I began noticing a certain spiritual essence in the area. This ranged from the presence of historic churches and 12th century monasteries to more personal, small-scale forms of spirituality. These subtler aspects are what I want to focus on here. A few summers ago, during my usual bike rides and hikes, I started noticing strange things. Pieces of fabric tied to tree branches and carefully arranged piles of stones. Initially, I brushed it off as children playing or maybe scouts doing activities. But over time, I realized there was more significance behind these objects. For instance, I came across large spiral arrangements of stones at hilltops, intricate patterns of rocks connecting trees like spokes on a wheel, and even carvings of symbols or ancient letters on the bark of trees. It was striking, both fascinating and slightly unsettling, because it all felt so foreign and deliberate. Eventually, I began to understand more of what these might represent. Among these discoveries were remnants of what I later learned were sweat lodges. I'm no expert, but these structures seemed connected to spirituality and shamanic practices, possibly inspired by Native American traditions. On a few occasions, I stumbled upon these rituals being prepared or even carried out. For example, during one bike ride, I noticed a few cars parked seemingly in the middle of nowhere. Many had dream catchers or feather decorations hanging from their rearview mirrors. Nearby, fabrics were tied to roadside trees, and faint sounds came from deeper within the woods. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. The first time, I saw a group of people gathering wood and constructing what looked like a small dome-like structure, later identified as a sweat lodge. They had set up makeshift sleeping spots nearby, where a few people appeared to rest in shifts, likely to prepare for an overnight ritual. I stayed at a respectful distance, but at one point, I crossed paths with a man carrying wood. I greeted him in French, and he returned the greeting politely, though quietly. He didn't seem local, unlike the rest of the group I'd seen from afar. Based on his clothing, loose, maroon garments typical of some spiritual traditions, I assumed he might be a guide or leader of sorts. A second encounter occurred in a different location but followed a similar pattern. What struck me this time was the presence of young children among the group. For those unfamiliar with sweat lodge ceremonies, they can be physically demanding and even dangerous for adults, let alone for kids. The process involves constructing a hut with a pit at its center and an external fire pit. Stones are heated in the fire until glowing hot, then transferred inside the hut, where water is poured over them to produce intense steam. The ceremony often incorporates tobacco pouches, herbs, and, in some cases, psychoactive substances. Even without drugs, the combination of heat and steam can be overwhelming, and fatalities have been reported. I sincerely hoped the children weren't participating in the more extreme parts of the ritual. The day after one of these encounters, I returned to the site to take a closer look. The structure remained, along with various intriguing artifacts. Tobacco pouches hanging from the lodge, stone patterns forming symbols I couldn't identify, and, most unsettling, a large bone about the size of a fist placed carefully on a tree stump. I wouldn't describe these experiences as terrifying, but they were undeniably fascinating and slightly eerie. They opened my eyes to a hidden layer of the region's character that I had never noticed before, a mix of the mystical and the mysterious. This story involves my dad and something he only recently shared with me. It came up when he was searching for a camping tent he'd lent out years ago. I had to admit it had been destroyed during a reckless incident at a local creek. A whole different story in itself. Back in the summer of 1980, when my dad was 17, he and his younger brother Mike, who was 14, were big on outdoor adventures. That summer, Dad had just finished school and wanted to go on one last big trip before starting a full-time job. They decided to tackle the Ridgeway Trail, a 180-mile hike in the UK, stretching from southern Scotland through the English countryside to central England. Their friend, Tony, joined the brothers on the journey. My great-grandpa dropped the trio off at the trail's starting point in Scotland. The first week went great. They met some friendly locals who treated them to meals and even gave them a roof over their heads for the night. Most nights, they camped out in clearings. One day, hoping to reach a village before dark to restock supplies, they pushed themselves to hike an extra 6 miles. Around 7 p.m., they reached a small village with a local inn. The innkeeper offered them a spot to camp in the field behind the pub after they stopped by for a drink. It was clear he knew they were underage, but business was business. His wife seemed uneasy about the idea, pulling him aside for a private word, but eventually agreed. After spending the evening chatting and drinking with the locals, the boys retreated to their tent. They were using an old oil lamp as their light source, hung in the center of the tent. When they turned it off for the night, they left it hanging. This small detail would prove crucial later. In the early hours, my dad woke up and switched the lamp back on, debating whether to step outside. The quiet was interrupted by the creak of a door opening and closing. He assumed it was the shed door moving in the breeze. But moments later, he heard the distinct sound of footsteps approaching their tent. Thinking it was the innkeeper, Dad reached for the zipper just as someone else unzipped the tent. The innkeeper stood there, shirtless, wearing just pajama bottoms and slippers. He claimed he'd heard growling and wanted to check if they were all right. Dad found it odd since there'd been no noises apart from the door and the footsteps. The man tapped the lamp, insisting it be turned off, before walking back toward the inn, visibly annoyed. The next morning, the innkeeper's wife made them breakfast. Her husband had left in his truck early, so they didn't get to thank him in person. As they packed up, they noticed small, pen-sized holes all over their tent. Dad assumed the animal the innkeeper mentioned must have caused them. Tony suggested they hike to the next village, a couple of miles back, to buy repair supplies. Leaving their damaged tent as a marker, they set out. A walker's shop in the village had no tents in stock, so they bought tape to patch the holes for the night and headed back as dusk fell. When they returned, they were shocked to find their tent set up, but fully ablaze. They quickly doused the flames with water from their bottles and the nearby stream. Inside, the oil lamp was shattered, clearly the cause of the fire. Someone had followed them, set up their tent, and deliberately lit it on fire. Dad's theory? The innkeeper was up to something sinister that night, but was thwarted when he realized Dad was awake. Setting their tent on fire was likely his twisted form of revenge. Initially, I thought Dad was exaggerating, but when I mentioned the story to Uncle Mike, he immediately launched into the same tale, calling it one of the strangest experiences of his life. And Mike never lies. When my wife and I first got married, she'd insist on taking me to these enormous family gatherings. They were always held far off in the countryside, usually on a ranch or in rented cabins, with some relatives bringing RVs or setting up tents. These reunions were massive. Everyone showed up, including her great-grandma in her wheelchair. Being the new husband, I felt obliged to join in, and I was amazed at the sheer number of people. By the end of the first day, there were probably 100 attendees, and by the second, the number had doubled. People often asked if her family was Mormon or Hispanic, but no, just good old Southern folk. One year, the reunion was held at a remote lakeside location. A series of small cabins had been rented, but they were all occupied, so my wife and I pitched our tent near the lake. I didn't mind, it gave me the chance to fish and have some space away from the 200 or so in-laws wandering about. We also had our chocolate lab, Max, and our son, Tim, who was about 5 years old. After setting up camp, we made the rounds, greeting relatives. Hugs from Aunt Clara, a firm handshake from Grandpa Joe, and playful teasing with the kids. While I might make it sound like a chore, these gatherings were actually enjoyable, at least initially. The first day was always fun, playing with the kids and catching up with everyone. But after a few days, things tended to go south. The kids would get restless, adults irritable, and eventually, a minor argument or two would break out. That first afternoon, we explored the trails around the lake. I led a group hike with Tim and some of the cousins. We found some cool spots: a dry creek bed with shiny stones, an animal burrow scattered with old bones, probably deer or small game, and other curiosities. During one hike, I spotted a hunter's blind nestled in a grove of trees. It was weathered, the fabric sun-bleached, and looked like it hadn't been used in years. Nothing seemed amiss, so we moved on. As the evening rolled in, we gathered around a fire with Uncle Ray and his kids. That's when we first heard the distant howl of a coyote. It got the kids excited, while the adults chuckled, unbothered. Coyotes weren't a real threat, especially with so many of us around. The howls continued throughout the night, echoing through the hills. It was fascinating to hear how the pack communicated, and it added a touch of wilderness to our evening. The next day, even more people arrived, bringing the count to over 200. The reunion was buzzing with activity: treasure hunts, races, potato cannons, and even a butter churning contest. By the afternoon, though, the heat and minor squabbles started to wear on people. Tim and I went fishing and played fetch with Max to escape the tension. By evening, we were back at our camp, enjoying the quiet as the reunion's noise began to die down. Later, while chatting around the fire, someone pointed toward the lake and asked, "Who's that?" I turned to see a figure leaning against a tree in the shadows. It was hard to make out, just an average-sized silhouette swaying slightly. We assumed it was a cousin who'd had too much to drink. But as the minutes passed, the figure didn't move. It was unsettling. Max started growling, his hackles raised, which only added to my unease. Aunt Martha suggested it was likely Luke, a cousin known for wandering off when drunk, and someone should check on him. Reluctantly, I volunteered. As I approached, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. When I got close enough to shine my flashlight, I froze. It wasn't Luke. It was a large black bear, standing on its hind legs, sniffing the air. I backed away slowly, but the bear dropped to all fours and began following me. Then I noticed a cub nearby. Bad news. I shouted a warning, and soon others from the camp came running, armed with flashlights and a few rifles. They formed a line, yelling and waving sticks. The bear hesitated, then retreated into the darkness with its cub. That night, I barely slept. Knowing a bear had been that close with my son and dog in a tent was terrifying. We later found out that the cabins and campgrounds had been discounted because they were part of a seasonal bear hunting area, off-season, of course. The family who organized the reunion hadn't realized they'd booked us a spot right in the heart of bear country. I've always loved hiking, largely because of where I grew up. Living near parts of a major hiking trail tends to make the outdoors part of your daily life. Around here, most people have trekked at least a section of it at some point. A few years ago, during early spring, I set out on a solo hike. It was just after a stretch of rain, so the trail was drying out. There weren't a ton of people that weekend, just a mix of day hikers and a few of us camping. It was nice knowing there were always people around in case something went wrong. By the second day, I was well into my 4-day trip, planning to cover about 25 miles. My friend was going to pick me up at a parking area on the last day. I carried everything I'd need for the hike in my pack. That morning, I came across 2 guys standing near a tree. We waved at each other and kept walking in opposite directions. It seemed like they were resting when I first saw them, but now they were hiking steadily toward me. This sort of thing happens all the time on the trail, so I didn't think much of it. When we crossed paths, I greeted them and asked where they were headed. Their response was odd. They mentioned a spot that wasn't in the direction they were going. I pointed this out and they laughed, saying they'd gotten turned around. They didn't seem to have a clear plan of where they were going or even where they'd started. The more we talked, the stranger they seemed. They didn't want help and dodged most of my questions. Another thing stood out: how clean they were. When I asked how long they'd been out there, one said 2 days and the other said a week. Their stories didn't line up, and I started feeling uneasy. I decided to move on and wish them luck, suggesting they'd reach a parking area if they kept going. For the rest of the day, I hiked without incident. By evening, my feet were aching, and the sun was setting, so I decided to set up camp. I usually keep things simple, but that night I took my time, made a fire, and cooked a proper meal. My campsite was a little off the trail, providing some privacy. While eating, I noticed a cliff nearby. It wasn't too far, so I decided to climb up and enjoy the view before the light faded. That decision turned out to be crucial. From the top, I saw movement through the trees below. It was those 2 guys again, moving off trail as if they were trying to stay hidden. Their sneaky behavior made my alarm bells go off. I returned to my camp and quickly doused my fire, packed my things, and secured my backpack to a tree using zip ties. It wasn't the safest setup, but it was the best I could do. I lay down, clutching my knife and flashlight, trying to sleep but staying alert. Sometime in the night, I woke to the sound of footsteps near my camp. They were moving around, and soon I heard them trying to mess with my pack. I yelled at them to leave, but instead, one of them rushed at me. He pinned me down, and soon the second guy joined in. I struggled, realizing this wasn't just a robbery, it was life or death. In a moment of panic, I grabbed my knife and stabbed the first guy in the thigh. He screamed and stumbled back. When the second guy came at me, I did the same, driving the blade through his boot into his foot. both of them retreated, yelling in pain. I grabbed my gear and ran the opposite way. When dawn broke, I found some hikers but didn't manage to get help until the fourth person, who had a satellite phone. We called for assistance, and I made it to a parking area where rescuers met me. At the hospital later, I spotted those same guys. I immediately told the authorities, who detained them. Turns out they'd been robbing hikers for months. Their car was full of stolen gear. That night had been part of a larger crime spree, and my report helped break the case. The experience left me shaken. For 2 years, I avoided the outdoors completely, sticking to work and staying in. Eventually, though, I found my way back to hiking. It took time, but I'm finally myself again, though I'll never forget that night. A few years back, I decided to go hiking by myself on various trails in the Appalachian region. For some reason, I thought it was perfectly fine for a woman in her late 20s to hike alone. Not the smartest choice, I admit. I had always wanted to visit Bald Peak, so I set out on the trip. It was a quiet Wednesday, so there weren't many people around. The trail leading to the summit was paved, making the hike fairly simple, though it was a bit steep. At the time, I was a smoker, which made it harder to keep my breath steady. Eventually, I reached the top and stepped aside to catch my breath. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed someone standing uncomfortably close to me. When I looked up, I saw a man, probably in his late 40s, with oily, dark brown hair. He said, "Hey, I noticed you were struggling a bit to get up here. Are you all right?" His sudden approach startled me, but I replied, trying to sound casual, "Oh, I'm fine. Just a smoker's lungs, I guess." I chuckled nervously to break the tension. He didn't laugh or move away. Instead, he kept staring at me. Feeling uneasy, I gave a polite nod and walked toward one of those viewpoint markers that show the names of distant mountains and towns. But he followed me. He struck up a random conversation, mentioning that he was newly divorced and part of a men's group traveling to various famous landmarks. He asked where I was from, and I answered briefly. Then he started oversharing about his divorce, how he suspected his wife of cheating, how he hid in their closet one night to spy on her, and how he caught her with a coworker in their bedroom. He muttered bitterly, "They both paid for that night." I made it pretty obvious that I was uncomfortable, shifting my weight and glancing around, but he continued talking without letting me get a word in. First, I thought he was just lonely and looking for someone to talk to, but then it hit me, he didn't seem to have anyone with him. I hadn't noticed any group of men around, so maybe he was alone the whole time. My discomfort grew, and I decided to excuse myself, saying I was going to head back down to the gift shop. But he trailed after me. The main path down had several smaller trails branching off, but I wasn't about to explore them since I was still catching my breath. He wasn't walking directly with me, but he was always close enough to make me uneasy. Suddenly, he called out loudly, "Hey!" Startled, I turned around. He was grinning widely, and his hair looked even greasier in the sunlight. "Why don't we take one of these trails together? I promise you'll have a great time," he said, his voice unnerving. I replied firmly, "No, thank you," and looked around for help. To my left, I saw 2 older women sitting on a bench watching the interaction. One of them called out to the man, "I think it's time for the young lady to head out now." Her words gave me a wave of relief. I smiled slightly and nodded at her before quickly making my way down the path. I walked past the gift shop and headed straight to my car. Thankfully, the man didn't follow me further. That was the last hike I went on alone. Looking back, I'm so glad nothing worse happened. I've since decided not to go on trips like that by myself again. Some years back, in early spring of 2010, I believe, I had just wrapped up my winter semester during my first year of college. It was spring break, and the weather had finally turned nice, so I decided to head outdoors with 3 friends. Living in the Pacific Northwest, we chose to explore a scenic route along the coast called Windcliff Drive. This road skirts the edge of Emerald Bay and the nearby shores, offering a breathtaking view of the water as it snakes along the cliffs. There are numerous pull-offs along the way, perfect for pictures or quick stops, and we decided to check one out. The plan was simple: hike down to the beach, enjoy some snacks and drinks, and soak in the beautiful day. The trail we picked led us down to a spot near a set of railroad tracks running parallel to the shoreline. These tracks, much like the road above, were frequented by wanderers and drifters. As we sat on some driftwood near the water, watching people pass by, it was clear that many were carrying their lives with them, wrapped in blankets or tarps. We spent about an hour there before realizing it wasn't as exciting as we'd imagined. Ready for a change of scenery, we decided to leave. On the way back, we spotted what seemed to be a better path leading up and chose to follow it. That decision marked the moment our day took an unexpected turn. A short way up the new trail, we noticed something on the ground, a blanket wrapped around a shape. From a distance, it was clear that it covered something solid, not quite as large as an adult, but big enough to catch our attention. Immediately, an unsettling thought ran through my mind. Don't be a child, don't be a child, don't be a child. When we got closer, we discovered it wasn't a child, but tragically, a dog. The poor animal's head was missing, severed cleanly just above the collar, which was still intact. Oddly, there was no blood, and the blanket looked fresh, as if it had just been taken from someone's home. The body didn't emit any odor, suggesting it hadn't been there long. Around it, branches and brush had been deliberately arranged to conceal it from the nearby tracks, only about 15 feet away. It was obvious someone had killed the dog and left it there recently. Disturbed, we decided to leave immediately. We scrambled up the steep trail and reached my friend's car as fast as we could. Without wasting any time, we sped off, leaving the unsettling scene behind. Later, we reported what we had seen to the local sheriff's office. Unfortunately, they seemed to dismiss it, speculating the dog might have been hit by a train, even when we mentioned its missing head. We never received any follow-up, so we're left to assume they either didn't investigate further or didn't find anything. I've avoided that stretch of road ever since. In the summer of 1995, I was 8 years old and scared of nearly everything, so this experience only added to my anxiety about the world. My mom and I traveled from Everett, Massachusetts, to Pinewood Forest Park in Maine for a camping trip. My dad planned to join us the following day because he had to work. Everything seemed normal as we set up our campsite. We pitched our tent, built a campfire, and relaxed. It was still light out when we noticed a lone man at the neighboring campsite. He had unkempt, oily hair and kept repeatedly running at a wooden post, jumping onto it and trying to balance on one foot. He did this over and over. It was strange, but we dismissed him as some eccentric loner and chuckled about it. My mom joked he might be training for a circus act. When night fell, the darkness was complete except for the glow of our campfire. My mom and I were roasting marshmallows when we heard footsteps crunching toward us from the neighboring campsite. Out of the trees, the man appeared, stumbling into our area. The firelight made him look gaunt and disheveled. I could sense my mom tense up. She asked him calmly, "Can I help you?" The man muttered, "I need help at my campsite." He paused, saying nothing else. My mom pressed, "What do you need help with?" The man, his clothes dirty and torn, replied, "I locked my keys in my van. I need you to come over and help me." Then he turned to me and added, "Don't worry, kid. You can stay here by the fire." A chill ran down my spine at those words. My mom, staying composed, replied, "I don't think I can help with that. Don't you have a spare hanger or something?" The man didn't back down. "You've got to have a hanger lying around, maybe near your tent." Firmly, my mom said, "No, I don't, and my husband will be here any minute." Maybe he can help you. He's pretty strong." The man hesitated, his expression unreadable. Then he muttered, "All right," and shuffled back into the shadows, adding, "If you find a hangar, come help me. I'll be over there." That night, neither of us slept much. My mom stayed alert, flinching at every noise outside the tent. Looking back, I realized she must have been terrified, worried the man might slash through the tent with a knife. When dawn finally came, we stepped out of the tent to find the man and his van were gone. My mom and I began to relax, thinking the ordeal was over. Later that day, my mom suddenly exclaimed, "Oh my gosh!" I rushed over to see her crouching near our tent, picking something up from the ground. She held it up for us to see, a metal hanger. We both stared at it in silence, unnerved. I now live in Austria, but I'll never forget that unsettling camping trip. This is a bit different from the usual stories, but I think it fits. In this case, I was the one who ended up being the creep. A couple of years ago, some friends and I planned a camping trip, which was really just an excuse for us to spend a few days drinking together. I couldn't make it earlier in the day because of work, so by the time I arrived, around 8:30 p.m., everything was already set up. Wanting to catch up with everyone, I started drinking pretty heavily right away. After a few hours, someone noticed we were running low on firewood, so we decided to turn it into a friendly competition to see who could gather the most. I wandered off on my own and found a small pile of leftover wood nearby. Thinking it was a great find, I brought it back to what I thought was our campsite. Nobody else seemed to be around, so I grabbed an axe and started splitting the logs, feeling pretty pleased with myself. Out of nowhere, a young man and woman stepped out of a nearby tent, their faces filled with pure terror. That's when it hit me. I was at the wrong campsite. From their perspective, it must have been horrifying. A random guy, clearly intoxicated, gleefully chopping wood with an axe at their campsite in the middle of the night. I immediately stopped, apologized profusely, and quickly left to find my actual group. It was a mistake I'll never forget.